So I think whether bottled water is any safer than tap water, I doubt it. I think in some ways tap water could be safer than bottled water.
Professor Alastair Boxall, welcome to Stress Free Longevity. Now, you are a professor of environmental science, and we're going to touch on a number of different environmental toxins and contaminants. But just as an opening statement, of all the environmental contaminants that you study, which are maybe the ones that concern you the most?
I think there's probably three classes. So things like some of the insecticidal chemicals I worry about in terms of their impact on organisms in aquatic systems. And then in terms of human health, I think probably the biggest issue is the PFAS chemicals, the forever chemicals, which I think pose a direct toxicological threat to human health. But then the other group that it's a more of an indirect effect is the antibiotics. So our concern is the presence of antibiotics in the environment might be selecting for resistance in bacteria, and that resistance could be getting back into the human population and animal populations and could be contributing to the antimicrobial resistance crisis.
Now, before we jump into some of that, you make a distinction between detection and danger. Can you explain what that means?
Yeah, so a lot of what I do is looking at the occurrence of chemicals in the environment. So when we go out and we measure chemicals in a river, for example, we use techniques such as a mass spectrometry to look at what's in the river. These methods are very sensitive, they're very selective. But what that means is that we're able to detect lots of things. So we detect things at very low levels. And in a typical water sample, that water sample could have hundreds, if not thousands, of different chemicals in it. Now, not all of those will be doing harm. The levels in the water are just so low that they're not actually posing a threat to organisms in the river or to us as humans if they get into drinking water. So we've got this challenge of the analytical methods are getting more and more sensitive. We're detecting more and more things, and that scares people. But I think we just have to keep at the back of our heads that they're probably only a small fraction of the hundreds of thousands of chemicals that we detect in a water sample will actually be at a level that could be causing some type of impact.
So, you do a lot of work with waterways. So, what is the state of the rivers and waterways of the UK, and what are some of the contaminants and chemicals that you do discover in the waterways?
The way the water quality is controlled in the UK is we're still influenced by EU regulations. There's something called the Water Framework Directive, which basically is all about trying to bring rivers across Europe and the UK to what we call good status. As part of that, what the environmental agencies do is they monitor the ecology of rivers and they monitor the chemical quality of rivers. We're at the situation at the moment where only 16% of freshwaters in England meet the EU criteria for good ecological status, and no river in England meets the criteria for good chemical status. So they're all failing in terms of ecological and chemical health. We detect a real mixture of chemicals in rivers. So it will include pesticides, so things used in arable farming. It will include hydrocarbons from transport. It'll include pharmaceuticals from our day-to-day use of pharmaceuticals, which will be released to the sewer system and then out into the environment. It'll include metals. So in Yorkshire, where I live, we still have a problem of legacy mining where you have concentrations of metals still being released from those mines into our river systems.
So, I guess the presumption of the general public is that water gets treated before it enters our homes. Now, how effective is that process, and what potentially can slip through that process?
I think the first thing to say is that drinking water treatment in the UK is pretty good. So I think the first thing to say is our drinking water tends to come from two places. It will come from river water, so surface water, or it'll come from the ground, so it'll come from deep aquifers. Now, obviously, river water can contain quite a complicated mixture of chemicals. So what the water companies do is they take that water through a treatment process. They do a first step which removes the sort of bulk organic material in the water. So this would be the colour from the water. They'll then probably feed it through filters and perhaps through some form of oxidation system, which will remove some of the chemical contaminants in the water. And then at the end, they will probably add chlorine to the water to kill off the microbes. So by the time the water's gone through that whole process, what we find is many of the chemical contaminants that we would see in a river are actually removed to quite a large extent. So the levels that we see in the final water are much, much lower than you'd find in the river. Now, there are things that slip through. So we do a lot of work on pharmaceuticals in the environment. One of the chemicals that we detect quite widely in rivers is a chemical called metformin. It's the treatment for type 2 diabetes. And that's one chemical that doesn't seem to be very readily removed by typical drinking water treatment processes. So we still find quite high concentrations of metformin in the treated drinking water. Now, that then raises the issue, should I worry about that? If you compare the level in the water to the level that someone with type 2 diabetes would be taking when they're taking that drug, the levels are really, really small. So we think the risk to human health is probably quite low.
Now, there's a lot of people who filter their water. Is it a benefit? Does that filtering make a difference sizably to any of those potential contaminants?
Can do. So there are data suggesting that some of the filtration methods will lower concentrations of some of the organic pollutants. People have suggested the PFAS, these forever chemicals. One way to perhaps lower your exposure to PFAS would be to install some form of water filter in your kitchen. So it will probably lower the exposure, but I think it's just worth keeping in mind that the level of exposure or the level of the concentration of these things in the water coming out of your tap is still pretty low. So it's not something that I lose sleep over, so I don't filter my water, but some people perhaps will do because they are concerned.
Now, what about bottled water? Inherently, you would assume it to be better or better filtered, but I'm not sure there's really justification in that.
Right.
So tell us about the difference between bottled water and tap water.
So I think bottled water brings its own problems. The actual material used to make the bottle, I mean, if it's plastic, that plastic is likely to have additives in it, and those additives could be leaching into the water. And there's also data suggesting that the levels of microplastics in the bottled water are much greater than you would get if you were drinking tap water. So I think whether bottled water is any safer than tap water, I doubt it. I think in some ways tap water could be safer than bottled water.
Are there any considerations for people maybe living in older homes, maybe lead piping or whatever? Any considerations about that potential risk?
Yeah, there are a sort of not an insignificant number of homes in the UK that still have lead piping. And if you live in a house that was built before the 1970s, it is possible that you're living in a house with lead piping. Lead is not a particularly nice substance, and it can cause acute effects, so things like vomiting. I think the levels that you get in tap water, that's not going to happen. But I think our main concern there is more the chronic exposure, the long-term exposure, which can result in things like neurological effects. There are ways in which, if you live in a house with lead piping, that you can reduce your exposure. So, I mean, obviously, the ultimate solution is to replace the piping with plastic piping. The water companies, for example, suggest that if you live in that type of house, if you run your tap first thing in the morning, just a bowl full of water through the tap, what that will do is it will clear the water that's been sitting in the pipes overnight that the lead has been leaching into, and that will have a big effect on the concentrations that you're exposed to. So that would greatly reduce the risks.
And does filtering impact lead exposure?
It would depend on the filter. So different filters will remove different things. So some filters will be very good at removing things like lead. Other filters will be very good at removing things like PFAS.
Like I said to you before, I filter, but I'm not even sure what I'm filtering. And I'm not even sure what the product itself filters. Are all filters the same? Do they all have different qualities? Do they filter different things? Or are they just one and the same thing?
Well, I think the first thing to say is I'm not a filter expert. I did used to filter my water, but the main reason for that was hardness. So at the time, you could buy filters in the shops that were basically there to reduce the calcium level in your water, the hardness. That's the stuff that furs up your kettle and potentially furs up your washing machine. Now, I have seen mention of filters that remove things like the PFAS chemicals, the forever chemicals. And I think there are data suggesting that some of these filters can be quite effective at removing some of these contaminants. I think my advice would be that if it's something that you're thinking of doing, research it, have a look on the internet about what the filter claims to do, and perhaps look at whether people have actually studied whether they actually do remove these things or not, and base your decision on that.
This is probably a slightly unfair question, but we have an audience from around the world. Are you aware of major differences between waterways in the UK, which you've mentioned is quite good, and the filtering process, and other countries around the world? Are they quite similar or are there quite stark differences?
There are massive differences. We've done monitoring of pharmaceutical pollution in rivers, and we monitored pharmaceuticals in more than 230 rivers across 104 countries. And we saw very, very big differences in the level of pollution. The levels in the UK are sort of in the middle. They're by no means the highest. You see much greater pollution in rivers in sub-Saharan Africa, in Asia, and also in Latin America. In those environments, the way that people are sourcing their drinking water can be very different. In some of these regions, you'll have people getting their water for cooking and drinking directly from the river. And so their exposure will be much, much different to what we get in the UK.
Now, let's move on to forever chemicals. These seem to be getting their time in the spotlight at the moment. A little bit of basic science just to begin with. What do we mean by forever chemicals?
So the scientific name is PFAS. These are chemicals that contain fluorine, and because they contain carbon bonded to fluorine, they're very, very stable, so they don't degrade. In some ways, that's really good. That gives the chemical quite useful properties. So it helps with things like water repellency, stain resistance. But what we're recognizing is that because we as society have been using these chemicals quite widely in lots of different products, they're everywhere now. And the problem we have is because they're everywhere and they don't degrade, even if we stop producing them now, we're still left with this sort of legacy residue that's going to remain in the environment for a very long time. And some of these chemicals, the data suggests that they're not very nice in terms of human health. They can affect our immune system, they can affect our reproductive system, and some of them are thought to cause cancers. We're in a situation where we got these things occurring pretty much everywhere. They are at very low concentrations, and they are going to persist.
And am I right in thinking you did a study in 2025 that showed that there's a very high amount in UK rivers? Can you tell us a little bit about that? And I guess second to that then, does the treatment process help? And is there anything else that we can do on top to minimize exposure from the water?
We did a monitoring study in 2025 for one PFAS. It was a chemical called TFA. This is a chemical that is receiving quite a lot of interest from the scientific community, but also the policy community. We detected it pretty much everywhere we looked in UK rivers. And in some locations, we found very, very high levels. There was one site in Glasgow where when we compared what we were seeing in Glasgow I think it was the second highest concentration ever reported globally. I think the jury is out at the moment as to whether this molecule actually poses a health risk or not. It's everywhere, and it's a molecule that seems to come from lots of sources. So there's data suggesting it comes from pesticide use, from pharmaceutical use, and also things like air conditioning in cars.
So, thinking broadly about PFAS, what are the kind of worst offenders in terms of human exposure?
Well, PFAS is a massive class of substances. It includes, I think, more than 10,000 different substances. And probably the two that we know most about, and the two that we're particularly concerned about, are a chemical called PFOS and another chemical called PFOA. So these are chemicals that were used in things like non-stick frying pans, waterproof coatings, so Gore-Tex, jackets, even the wrappings that you get when you go and buy a takeaway, the sort of waxy coating of some of the wrappings used to contain some of these substances.
We need to balance some knowledge about our exposure, but also get a bit of a balanced perspective on it. Like, how much can we actually influence it? How big of a risk is it? And then, what, if anything, should we do to kind of minimize our exposure? And I guess, is there any changes that you've made based on what you know about forever chemicals?
So I think the first thing to say is that it's probably impossible to avoid exposure to PFAS. Yeah, they are everywhere. So if I took a sample from your body and my body and we analysed them for PFAS, we would detect them. I think because of that and the fact that they're everywhere, it's very hard to avoid. I think we have to probably sort of put the risk into a little bit of perspective. I think personally, we as a society should be working to reduce emissions of PFAS, and that ultimately will result in reduced human exposure. But that's probably not going to help my exposure. I think 10 years down the line that we'll start seeing improvements. The way I think about it is that while I have been exposed to PFAS, compared to some of the risks from other things that I do day to day, like getting in a car to drive to work or crossing the road, the threat from PFAS is probably quite small from my PFAS exposure. I think we have to put it into perspective. I think my approach, from my view, is that as a society, we should be working to reduce PFAS exposure so that future generations benefit from that, from the health side of things. But for many of us that have already been exposed and are being exposed, there's not a lot we can do about it. So I think there's this problem of making people scared. And I think that's probably worse for people's health than actually sort of recognizing actually that even though we are being exposed, the risk compared to some of the other things that we do day to day is actually quite low. So yeah, maybe if your non-stick frying pan is old, maybe if the coating is scratched and flaking, maybe time to sort of throw it away and replace it with a new frying pan that's PFAS free. If you've got an old sofa that might have been treated with Scotchgard, perhaps think about changing your sofa to something that hasn't been treated with Scotchgard. That would, in terms of your exposure to your indoor environment, your home environment, would lower exposure to PFAS.
Let's talk about food. Now, we hear a lot about pesticides and other chemicals used in food production. Is there cause for concern? Are there any positive steps being taken in that area?
I think the first thing to say is just like water, food safety is quite well regulated in the UK. So the Food Standards Agency will be monitoring different foodstuffs for a whole range of different chemical contaminants, and they'll be comparing those to safe levels. That system is there to protect the health of the population. I think the problem is, and it's the same with water, is the number of chemicals that we routinely monitor in food is still quite limited. So there are chemicals that we know can be accumulated into food that actually aren't regularly monitored, and there aren't safe values set for them. So, for example, we've worked on pharmaceuticals in food. So one of the things that will happen to a pharmaceutical when you excrete it is it will go down the sewer system into the sewage works. Some of these chemicals can stick to the sludge in the sewage works, and that sludge is then applied to land as a fertilizer. And we know that if you have a pharmaceutical going on to land in fertilizer and you grow a crop on that land, then you can, for some of the chemicals, see them accumulated into the crop material. We think the exposure is quite low for the chemicals that we've looked at, but there could be other chemicals that we've not looked at where exposure might be higher and where the concerns might be higher. So what I would like to see is a regulatory monitoring system that thinks a bit more broadly. So thinks about these sort of wider universe of chemicals that we use as a society and the potential for those chemicals to enter the food chain, and to actually prioritize those and set safe values for those so that we are perhaps broadening out our monitoring to be a little bit more protective.
Is organic food worth it for health?
I don't eat organic food on purpose. I see a benefit of pesticide use in terms of crop production and producing safe food. I think going back to what I was just talking about in terms of food safety, there are limits on the concentrations of pesticides in foodstuffs that have been set, and risk assessments have been done on these pesticides to ensure that they're safe to human health. I think on the other side of things is that organic farming doesn't necessarily use no chemicals. Some organic farmers, I think, will use metal-containing pesticide treatments. So they're not synthetic pesticides, they're more sort of natural, but natural doesn't necessarily mean that it's safe.
Yeah, I've heard you mention that before, that not all natural compounds and materials, even in clothing, etc., are safe. Some of the most toxic ones can be natural, quote unquote. Do you want to expand on that a little bit?
Yeah, I mean, I think if you look at what we know about toxicology, a lot of people claim that some of the most toxic chemicals are actually produced naturally. A good example would be some of the toxins produced by shellfish in response to an algal bloom. Some of these things are the most toxic chemicals to humans that we know of, and they can actually kill you. So natural doesn't always mean that it's better for our health.
So, for the health conscious person who just wants to feel like they're making some positive steps towards better health, are there any particular recommendations you would have with regards food choices, food storage, food cleaning, anything that you do or anything that would be potentially beneficial from a health perspective?
Well, I think the first thing to say is that I don't adapt my diet to minimize exposure to chemicals, but there are things that people could think about. So we did some work some time ago actually looking at uptake of chemicals from soils into plant material. We worked with carrots and we looked at the residue inside the carrot and on the carrot peeling. And we did find the levels in the peeling were much higher than in the main body of the carrot. So if it's something that concerns you, perhaps wash or peel your vegetables. And then I think thinking a little bit more holistically, some of the more intensive animal farming we know is associated with quite high use of some classes of chemicals. So things like antibiotics. You don't have that scale of use in less intense, more well managed farming systems. So that might not benefit your health directly, but if you move to sourcing your materials from more animal friendly farming practices, I think that's going to have a benefit in terms of chemical emissions to the broader environment and will help the health of the broader environment. Some of these intense chicken farms, for example, there was a proposal near where I live that we were going to have one of these mega farms, the type of farms that you get in America. These farms in America use a lot of chemicals to treat the animals, and they'll have quite bad effects on the surrounding environment. So I think move away from sourcing food from those types of sources, then it could be a good thing.
I wanted to touch on a lesser known risk, and that is pet flea treatments. This is something that I learned from you recently. Do you mind just letting us know what is the surprising discoveries that you made in this field?
Yeah, so we're beginning to recognize that the flea treatments that we use on our cats and dogs could be causing harm to the environment. Some of the chemicals that are used in these treatments are some of the most environmentally toxic chemicals that we know of. They're very toxic to invertebrates. That's what they're designed to kill. And the issue is that a lot of invertebrates are really important in terms of the health of our rivers. We're recognizing that I think we have 22 million cats and dogs in the UK. As a society, we're moving to a stage where we're much more routinely treating our pets with these treatments. So a lot of pets now are on pet health plans where these treatments are sent through the post once a month. And that's going to result in higher emissions of these very toxic chemicals to the environment. And our concern is that that's going to have a negative effect on the health of our rivers.
And is there thought to be any risk to humans with these treatments?
Everything poses a risk, but the levels that I think you would be exposed to are probably quite low. It's not an area that I know a great deal about, but I think before these products are approved, the companies will have to take the product through a human health risk assessment to assess whether the use of the product is going to pose a risk to the owner. My understanding is that if there was a sort of an unacceptable level of risk, then the product wouldn't be approved. Now, the problem we have at the moment is that risk to the environment is not actually included in the authorization process for a new flea treatment. So the assumption up until now of the regulatory authorities is that the use of these chemicals on cats and dogs is so low that environmental exposure is going to be low. When we're in a situation where you have 22 million cats and dogs, one cat or dog for every 3 people, and a lot of these cats and dogs are on monthly treatments of these materials, then my prediction is that's going to mean that quite large amounts will be emitted to the environment. And I think we probably need a shake-up of the regulations.
What exactly is the chemicals that are of most concern? And is there any difference between how the flea treatment is applied? You can sometimes get these drops that you can put on the animal, or you get these collars. Is it the same ingredients in both? And are there any safer alternatives that you're aware of?
One of the chemicals that we're most concerned about at the moment is a chemical called imidacloprid. So this is a neonicotinoid insecticide. It was actually used quite widely in arable agriculture, but it's now been banned. But we do still detect it quite widely in rivers. And the main source, we think, is from pet treatments. Now, obviously, these things can be applied in different ways. So I think some of these things, you can get the collars, you can get the spot-on treatments. We don't really understand fully yet what different application methods do in terms of environmental exposure, whether one is better than the other. The other thing is that there are quite a large number of what we call active ingredients that can be used in these products. So I think in total there's about 30 different active ingredients. We know quite well what some of these do in the environment, like imidacloprid, but for many others, we don't really know whether they occur in the environment, how toxic they are. We've done a little bit of work on one substance called fluorolana, which is one of the alternative substances. Our monitoring suggests that the occurrence of fluorolana is actually a lot lower than imidacloprid. So it could be that if you use a fluorolana product, that it would be better for the environment than imidacloprid. But we don't really have the full data set yet to say that for definite.
Now, one of your key areas of research is antimicrobial resistance, and you've described it as a silent pandemic. What does environmental pollution have to do with this?
Yeah, the problem of antimicrobial resistance has been recognised for a long time. So in 2019, it is estimated that antimicrobial resistance, or AMR, killed an extra 1.2 million people globally. Up until fairly recently, it was assumed that that was being acquired either from the clinic or maybe from animal farming. But what we're beginning to recognise is that the environment may be contributing. We detect antibiotics very widely. In our global monitoring data, we detect antibiotics almost everywhere that we looked in the world. And we detect the chemicals at concentrations that we think are high enough to select for resistance in many cases. So what our concern is if you've got these antimicrobials occurring in a river or in soil, and they're at levels that are able to select for resistance in bacteria, and then those resistance genes get back into the human population or the animal population, then that could be playing quite an important role in the AMR crisis.
Are there any risks to swimming in waterways? Is there any potential contaminant risk just being in the water?
I think the biggest risk from swimming in rivers is probably from exposure to the microbial contamination, so the bacteria. While there will be chemicals in the river that people are exposed to, the concentrations will be quite low. So I think in terms of acute risk to human health, it is probably quite low. The only issue I think perhaps that you should be potentially concerned about is if you swim in a river every day throughout your life and you're swallowing that water every day throughout your life, then you will be exposed to the chemicals in that water continuously. As a scientific community, we don't really understand whether this very long-term, low-level exposure poses a threat to human health or not.
Is there any time when risk from contamination in waters is worse than at other times? You know, if there's been heavy rainfall or whatever.
There's definitely sort of higher risk when the storm overflows are flowing. These are the things that they're designed into the wastewater system, into the sewer system, and they're there basically because sewage works are only designed to treat a certain amount of water. Now, if you have a lot of rain, then you tend to exceed the capacity of the sewage work. So what happens is the water or the sewage is diverted around the treatment plant and it's emitted through these overflows into the river. But what we're seeing is that these overflows are flowing even when it's not raining quite a lot of the time. And that's due to a number of reasons. It's due to water companies not investing properly in the treatment network. It can be due to accidents and breakages. So I think what I would advise is if you swim in a river, probably don't do it after heavy rainfall. So I'd wait a few days because that's when these overflows are going to be flowing and emitting bacteria into the rivers. There's a lot more open access now to information on when these overflows are flowing. There's maps, and these are live maps of some of the regions showing which overflows are flowing and which aren't flowing. So if you're going to go swimming in the river and you're concerned about this, you might want to look at that map and say, well, yeah, are there overflows flowing? And again, if they are, maybe avoid going for a dip.
So, as we're rounding off, what do you feel are the biggest misconceptions about environmental contaminants in health? What's maybe overhyped or anything that you'd like to address?
I think the issue that perhaps receives more attention than perhaps it should compared to some of the other classes of contaminants is the microplastics and human health. I think there's no doubt that microplastics are an issue, but there's quite a lot of scary data you see in the news that is based on not very good science. And I think we need more robust science to understand whether these materials really pose a risk to health or not. In terms of things that you could do to reduce your exposure to chemicals, And I guess reduce exposure of others to chemicals. In your household, perhaps you could be thinking about sourcing the products you use from companies that perhaps have a better sustainability record. There are multinational companies that are much more proactive and visionary about this stuff than others. I think in terms of your diet, probably getting your food locally, having a varied diet, try and avoid factory farmed food is going to benefit the wider environment in terms of chemical exposure. And then I think transport. We're still at a stage in the UK where we have big problems with air quality due to emissions from traffic. The move to electric vehicles is going to help, and walking to work rather than driving is going to help. So those types of changes in behaviours, I think, will help reduce what I call the pollutome in the UK. And I think that's also going to benefit your health more generally if we walk more rather than rely on the car. We have a balanced sort of diet that has more local food in it. I think that's going to benefit our health and well-being more generally, not just in terms of chemical exposure.
Professor Alastair Boxall, thank you so much. We usually leave our speaker with one last chance. If there was just one or two things that you would want us to walk away with, what would you like the audience to remember most from this conversation?
I think the flea treatment is quite a good example. I think it's, as an individual, just think a little bit more about the chemicals that you use and think about what they be doing, and just recognize that, that once you've used it, it's not the end of the story. These things can then migrate out into the environment where some of them could be having impacts. So I think it's, begin to think about that, sort of learn about it. And I think that will then help us as a society to begin to transition to more sort of like healthy, sort of non-toxic environment.
Professor Boxall, thank you so much for joining me today.
No problem. It's been great chatting.